Well, of all the expectations we have for our schools, discipline can be one of the hardest subjects to master for some of those trying to learn it and for some of those trying to teach it. Bad behavior has consequences, and so does how we handle it. In fact, school suspensions emerged as one of the primary focuses of the Ferguson Commission. So tonight, what are those consequences for the short term, the long term, for the students, and for all of us? Stay tuned.
Stay Tuned brings together local experts, journalists, civic leaders, and regular people to have tough conversations for a stronger St. Louis. Add your voice to our conversation, and you're at the table as we stay on top of current events and go deeper, bringing more light and less heat to the issues that matter. From the 9 network of public media in Grand Center, this is Stay Tuned. When you look at trends in school discipline over the past couple of decades, you might notice similarities to the approach our country has taken with crime. Often get tough, zero tolerance tactics, not just for guns in schools or violent fights, but suspensions for things like tardiness, dress code violations, disrespect, and defiance. And more schools have turned over discipline to police, when in the past they might have handled an issue in the school or with parents. But then again, the world and the burdens kids bring to school have changed too.
Discipline is necessary. You have to have some type of discipline and structure in your classroom, or kids will run over you, flat out. We can talk about, all the, these ideals and things of that nature, but 2 to 3 kids can totally disrupt 40 with no problem. So if you do not have structure and discipline, then nothing will be, the other 37, 36 kids will suffer.
When you were a first-year teacher, were you ready to deal with the issues you deal with at U City, for example?
No, absolutely not. And I haven't been in the game that long, but I don't feel like I've actually completed learning anything.
But has a disparity developed in our discipline? A nationwide study of the 2011-2012 school year showed that students of color and disabilities were overall disciplined at far higher rates than white students. And compared to other states, the study showed the discipline gap in Missouri is large. 27% of black high school students got out of school suspensions that year, compared to about 7% of white students. And in elementary schools, just under 2% of white children were suspended that year, compared to 14% of black children. The biggest racial disparity in grade schools in the entire country.
90% of our teachers are white women, and our student population across the country is 36% children of color. And we haven't had a race conversation in education.
Well, first of all, our thanks to Jim Kircher and our friends at St. Louis Public Radio. Those were snippets of a town hall hosted here at the 9 Network that will air this coming Monday, November 9th at 7 p.m. They've done a lot of reporting on this issue that we are tackling here tonight. We are tackling it with a panel of educators, but first we are starting with Norman White, Associate Professor at St. Louis University. And Norman, you're a criminologist, so correct?
Yes.
Tell me what a criminologist, what draws you to this work around school discipline?
In the field of criminology, what we find is that the kids who have trouble in school, who are failing out of school, tend to have been suspended earlier in their lives, and it's a developmental thing. So the earlier that begins to happen in their lives, the more likely they are to wind up running into justice system interactions, and it's just not tenable to not pay attention to that.
So tell me about the work you're doing around this topic.
So I've begun working in the city of St. Louis public schools to look at suspensions in the schools, but also academic achievement, and it's also a partnership. It's not a program. We're not bringing a solution to buildings. We believe that the beginning of this is that we need to have dialogues with the people in the schools. Talk to principals, talk to teachers, try to understand what the reality is and what they see as viable solutions. I think that very often, and this is the way I read the literature, is that we don't pay attention to the voices of the people who have to live in that reality. And since we don't pay attention, we try to put in place solutions that don't work or they work marginally, and it seems to me to be a waste of money. So we're at a point where we wanted to begin with the conversation.
So what is that reality? For those of us who haven't been in the classroom in a couple of decades or more, how have things changed?
Things have changed. In the city of St. Louis public schools, the homeless population, for example, is 40% of the kids, according to DESE's data. If a child doesn't have a place to go home at the end of the day, he's probably spending a lot of his day thinking about where he's going next, where he's going to sleep tonight, where he's going to eat, and what's that place going to be like. Where kids are faced with challenges today that are much greater than when I was a kid. The challenges that they're struggling with are often things that create trauma for them. And if we don't approach it from the standpoint of they've had traumatic experiences and let us understand that trauma, and then how do we help them to deal with that, as well as to help us to educate them, we're not going to be very successful.
So has that manifest in a less disciplined education environment? Has that manifest in a more violent student population, or have we changed our approach to discipline?
Well, I think that here's the problem, that we have a lot of kids who are born into situations that are stressful on an ongoing basis. That is having an impact on them developmentally. That it has an effect, that living in stress as a constant, it has an effect on brain architecture, it has an impact on impulsivity, emotional development. By the time kids get to school, if they've been struggling with all that life that's been going on outside of the school building, they're bringing that into the buildings. I was at a meeting just before I came here with the principals in schools that I'm working with, talking about a set of twins, for example, who have such psychological problems that they're lost for what to do with them. That they'll have them come sit in their office and just be there because they disrupt the classroom so much, and it's not, there's no alternative for them. We under-resource. Some part of the work that I'm doing was built out of an equity project. So we're looking at racial equity and how that plays itself out. Schools, our urban schools, are very often under-resourced. They don't get the adequate money for counselors, for social workers, for the kinds of staff that are needed to deal with complex problems. And what winds up happening is we expect teachers to be teachers, social workers, babysitters, behavioral therapists, family specialists, and that's simply not something that we can continue to do.
So what do you make of that research we cited there, that there is that disparity racially and in other ways between how students are disciplined, between African-American students, white students, et cetera?
It's huge. It's huge. I think that in part it's how we see young African-American children, that there is some bias within all of us about how we see others. But the cost of that, you know, I don't want to lay the blame solely on the teachers. The reality is that a lot of the young African-American children are coming from struggling environments. You know, their families are struggling, and you know, if their behavior is untenable in a school building, then we have to figure out solutions to that.
Is there research to answer the question? Because some would ask, the obvious question may be, regardless of why, are the students being suspended more, simply not misbehaving more? Or do you see research that says the same behavior by two different races gets different results?
So there is a problem there. That a lot of the suspensions, according to the data I looked at for the city, are not for type 1 offenses, so the more serious offenses, bringing weapons into schools, assaults, and that kind of thing, that they're discretionary offenses. And those discretionary offenses have led to almost 80% of the suspensions that we're seeing in the city of St. Louis schools, for example. It means the choice is being made. So part of our project, or the work we're doing, I hate to call it a project, the partnership we have is about trying to get the teachers to understand, the school personnel to understand the nature of life in the community that the kids come from, that understanding the trauma that they've experienced, and to become more sensitive to how do I help them to deal with what it is that's going on, that the behavior is just a manifestation of something else that might be happening.
Norman, thank you very much. Stay with us. Before we join our panel of educators, though, we want to review this week's Twitter chat that informs the show we're having tonight. Here's what you had to say this Tuesday night.
Tuesday night's Stay Tuned Twitter chat covered school discipline and how it's used in our schools. Casey Hitton wasn't surprised by the news earlier this year of Missouri being ranked #1 in suspensions of black elementary students. She tweeted, "For a state that had to be sued to integrate and sued to end it, this should not surprise anybody." To lessen the rates of suspensions overall, she suggested that eliminating zero tolerance would be a good start, then more counselors and social workers. STL Rainbow followed up with, "We need to track down the monsters responsible for coming up with zero tolerance and put them in detention." MW and STL tweeted, "Parents do need to take a role in a kid's life when they're at school. It isn't just free daycare. Help out." MW is also concerned about the correlation of high suspension rates and the likelihood of going to prison. Do we have an entire subsection of our youth population believing, learning by example, that prison is inevitable for them? Want to be a part of our next chat? Follow us on Twitter at StayTunedSTL and join the conversation on Tuesday nights at 8 p.m. with the hashtag StayTunedSTL.
Okay, let me introduce the people that are joining Norman and me here at the table, and then I have something I want to show you one more time. Karen Hall, Superintendent, Maplewood Richmond Heights School District. Thank you for joining us. Also, Edward Johnson, Principal at Brentwood High School, and also a Principal at University City High School is Michael Macklin. Thank you all for being here. I want to go back to a graphic that we have that really kind of sets the stage for a significant part of our conversation here tonight. The discipline gap in Missouri. This is looking at the school year of 2011-2012. Over 27% of African American high school students received suspensions, while only about 7% of white students were suspended. So just picking up on what Norm and I were talking about, what do you see that represents? What does that tell you about what's going on in your school and schools at large?
Well, the first thing that comes to my mind is a clear understanding of expectations. And do we have the same expectations for all of our students? That is starting on the district level, where I sit, and then translated on down to all the various stakeholders that we are responsible for the students. If we do not clearly articulate what we expect of our classroom communities, and if there are inequities, that needs to be articulated and explained. And from my perspective, if we notice that this is happening, it needs to be addressed. Because I know on my level, I go through all of the reports every quarter, and I disaggregate according to different groups, race, gender, if they have special education courses, if they're free and reduced lunch rate students. It can be monitored in a way where we can see what's going on and if there's patterns. So yes, it's telling me that there isn't a clear expectation for all students, that we're doing our best to keep our students in school.
So are we saying we need to be a little more gentle with our students? Because I'm sure there are a lot of teachers. We had the gentleman in the town hall clip there talking about how one student can derail the education for an entire classroom.
And I would say to that case, that's a great point, but I would say that even with suspensions, there needs to be a restorative justice piece. The restorative justice piece which can increase accountability but decrease suspensions, and that's correct. One student can derail 400, not just 40, but with the accountability piece and letting that student understand the clearness and what they're accountable for, I think is the key.
Casey, I would add to that. So you want to begin to create a culture that shares that philosophy of restorative discipline, and so that when kids fail and you can count on that happening, you want to be able to put a resilience plan in place that will allow kids to restore their citizenship the right way in their community, while also kind of more or less mending feelings with a potential victim if indeed something took place where they offended someone in a certain way. but to be able to have those supports in place and those champion teachers and those administrators that understand how to relate to certain behaviors, where they can really speak explicitly to the type of information kids need to hear and be taught on how they need to be sensitive and show empathy to their peers, but also how to be resilient and show grit in those times when they really need to bounce themselves back on track.
So we talked about consequences at the beginning of the show. And Norm, jump in, and anybody, what are the consequences of repeated suspensions for things on that kind of that secondary level that you're talking about? What are the long-term effects?
You're not in school. You're not learning. Right there, that is the biggest consequence. You're not guaranteed the opportunity to have a high quality education because you're at home.
Are you more likely to get in trouble as you get older?
Exactly.
Or are you more likely to get in trouble post?
Well, the gap, since we're talking about a discipline gap, the achievement gap, I mean, that's a direct correlation. If you're going to talk about certain groups of students that are achieving below where they should be, well, dig a little deeper. What does the discipline rate look like for some of those students? Are they actually in school? Not that they can't learn, but are they in school?
Is this a high school issue, or does it start earlier?
I think it's earlier. It's much earlier. So if you look at the data from that UCLA report, what they said was that at the elementary school level, the city of St. Louis leads the nation in suspensions of kids. If you have kids that are being suspended in preschool, kindergarten, first grade, and losing instructional time, by the time they get to the point, to the third, fourth grade, they are already further behind because they aren't prepared for the transition into that reading to learn period. So you asked me earlier about why I, as a criminologist, am interested, because what I understand is that in the beginning of education, we're teaching kids how to learn to read, how to learn the fundamentals of school. If they're not in school, by the time they get to fourth grade, where they have to then start reading to learn and being more engaged in the process, the trajectory starts to spiral downward because they've already been kind of detached from the educational situation.
So Casey, how that plays out in the classroom is that when kids know that they're behind, and teachers set this in what in some cases can be an unreasonable expectation for certain kids that they know are behind, it kind of creates this attitude in a kid where the kid does not necessarily present themselves well from that point on. They don't know how to deal with failure, and they need people to coach them on how to bounce back from situations when they happen. If you don't have someone that can really work closely with kids in those moments where they're behind or they're lacking some kind of information that they need to be successful, if you don't have an individual that can relate to them and can really work with them at that critical key moment in their life, that downward trend is going to take place, and from that point on, it's going to be difficult moving forward.
Which I guess goes back to you were talking about the under-resourced schools that might not have the counselor and et cetera. Okay, pause for 1 second, because speaking of research, the research also shows that this discipline disparity doesn't just break down only along racial lines. We have a story now from Maya Northfleet with one student's very personal story with her struggle with discipline.
Meet Camilla McMiller. Right now, she's a senior in the visual arts pathway at Grand Center Arts Academy. Before Grand Center Arts Academy, Camilla attended another local school. As a young trans woman of color, Camilla has experienced bullying in the classroom, which led to confrontations with classmates that resulted in disciplinary action in the form of in-school and out-of-school suspension.
A lot of times when I would, just be minding my business and somebody would say something to me and I would lash back or, curse them out, I would get disciplined for it. I was, when I did start transitioning, right, I did start hormones. I had boys who would throw things at me. There was boys who are people who would come up and sexually harass me.
When Camilla would ask staff for help, she didn't always get the help she'd hoped for.
She told me that basically it was something that I needed to get used to, and that because of my identity as a trans woman, that it was going to happen to me. And so instead of having something done about the sexual harassment. That's what I was told.
Exchanges like Camilla's happen far too often. According to research from the Center for American Progress, 1/3 of LGBT youth report that school officials fail to address harassment, which then causes distrust of school administrators. Lesbian, gay, and bisexual youth are also 3 times more likely to experience harsh disciplinary treatment in school than their non-LGBT peers. Camilla, feeling the need to confront her bullies, found herself being suspended several times for many days, which resulted in her missing classwork.
So out of school suspension, I've probably been suspended about 5 times. And in school suspension, I've probably been over 20 times. Basically, I was missing out on school, but also I didn't know what I was doing. So when I would go back to school, I'd be like, okay, so what is my work? You know, I'm getting piled up with all this work. And I'm just like, you know, I don't know how to handle this. That did set me up for failure because I am a senior now trying so hard to catch back up.
Thank you, Maya Northfleet, for that report. Now, here's one other way, as we continue to draw on this research, just one more time here. Another way that this breaks down students with disabilities in the state of Missouri, when we're talking about elementary students, about 3.5% versus 5.5%, and then in the high school level, 9+% versus 17% suspension rates. So another way that this topic breaks down. In addition to the LGBT issues and racial issues we have discussed so far. I want to go back to the Twitter chat we had earlier this week. The STO changed, that's the Ferguson Commission. They're recommending that students 3rd grade and under not be suspended. We asked folks if they agreed or disagreed. We got a 50-50 split there, so I'll put it to the panel here. 3rd grade and under, maybe we start with the research that you've done, Norman, would you say just eliminate them altogether for 3rd grade and under suspensions?
Casey, I think that they need to be eliminated. I think that they need to find solutions to help those kids who are having those problems at that early age. Again, for me, it's an equity issue. If you under-resource schools, if you don't put sufficient staff in the building to help the teachers to do their job, I'm not sure who we blame for that. You know, often people want to blame the schools, they want to blame the teachers. I think there's enough blame to go around, and we need to start thinking in that way.
Thoughts on 3rd grade? Is that something that the Ferguson Commission recommends?
Casey, what I would say is that the consequence needs to change the behavior. And so when you see the suspension that happens over and over and over again, is it really changing the behavior? If it's not changing the student's behavior, then what is the need for the suspension?
What kind of I would be curious to find out what kind of infraction it was. If it was a non-violent type of a situation, and maybe a situation where a teacher were to feel as if the kid were being insubordinate, teachers need to be trained on how to de-escalate certain behaviors so that kids don't escalate themselves in those situations. Kids know when teachers care. And teachers who are equipped with those skills to show that they care when they deliver their message tend to get really, really good results. But for those teachers who don't know how to relate and they send the wrong vibe, kids pick up on that energy and they go the other way, and they don't have a problem with failing themselves for as long as it means they prove to the teacher that they understand the fact that they're not being supported. So they'll fail to prove their message, and unfortunately we see that too often.
Karen, as we're getting down to the last couple of minutes that we have here tonight, what should we be doing when the problem can look, I'm guessing, very different between different school districts?
It can, and it concerns me when we make blanket statements about what should be done for children. You know what, every situation for families are different, and we haven't even talked about bringing parents into the conversation and partnering with parents and creating real, authentic, caring relationships with our parents. It's not just the schools. We have to have parents in there and have them accountable, and if they need support, how can we support them? And in some cases, it's educating them. So, you know, moving forward, I don't want us to take the other end of the spectrum where we had zero tolerance. And that's where a lot of the poor choices were made with over-disciplining students. And it was a certain population of students.
Could zero tolerance not maybe, or do some people think that zero tolerance could actually take some of that bias out if every student is treated in a set way?
The bias is within the person who has the power to discipline the child, regardless. And so we need to look at the educators and their understanding. And resources are huge. We need to be able to say, okay, what implicit biases are we responsible for when we engage in a situation where we have to discipline a child? Are we truly being equitable? And paying attention to the antecedents before the behavior. What other layers are happening here that created this situation? So we need to train, just like my colleagues here at the table have said, and I don't want to represent that. It's incredibly important that we support our educators with having an understanding of how do we help students before we give this consequence or we suspend a student, because that is your end result. There's so much that's happening prior to you giving discipline to a student.
So I had 5 pages of questions. I don't think we made it through one. We're out of time, but the good news is Monday night, 7 o'clock, Monday the 9th at 7 o'clock. Suspended Futures, the school discipline debate. Thank you all for your time. We appreciate you being here.
Thank you.